Fairview, Pennsylvania, had never been a place for big events. This quiet town of 8,000 people lived a measured life, where the most significant news was usually the results of the local school team's football games or the annual harvest fair. But in August 2024, everyone was talking about one thing: the upcoming wedding of Chuck Carter and Angelica Reynolds, scheduled for September 15th. Casper Carter stood in his metalworking shop on Industrial Street, wiping his hands with an oily rag. At 48, he still looked like a strong man: broad shoulders, hard-working hands, and the confident gaze of a man accustomed to solving problems on his own. Carter Metalworks was his brainchild, built from scratch 20 years ago. Now it specialized in manufacturing metal structures for local construction projects, gates and fences for private homes. "Dad, have you seen the bill from the steel supplier?" Chuck entered the workshop, holding an envelope in his hands. At 26, he was a carbon copy of his father in his youth, just as tall, with the same gray eyes and determined chin. Only his hands were cleaner, as he was more involved in the electrical side of their projects. Casper quickly took the envelope without even looking at the contents. "Put it in the office, son. I'll take care of it later." He knew what was inside: another reminder of overdue debt. Metal was getting more expensive, customers were delaying payments, and the bank was becoming less patient with each passing month. "Okay, listen, I wanted to talk to you about the wedding." Chuck brushed his hair back with a gesture he had inherited from his mother. "Angelica is worried about the cost. Maybe we should do something more modest." Casper turned sharply. "No way! My only son is getting married once in his life. We're going to have the best wedding in Fairview." He put his heavy hand on his son's shoulder. "Trust me, Chuck. Everything will be fine." Chuck nodded, though he remained uneasy. In recent months, his father had become tense, often staying late in his workshop, and when he thought no one was watching, his face took on a worried expression. But Chuck was used to trusting his father in everything. Casper always found a way out of any situation. At that moment, on the other side of town, at the Style Beauty Salon on Main Street, Angelica Reynolds was putting the finishing touches on her client's hairstyle. The salon was small, only 4 chairs and a manicure table, but it was popular among the women of Fairview. Angelica had been working there for 3 years, ever since she finished her stylist training in nearby Greensburg. "So, are you ready for the big day?" asked Mrs. Harwood, one of her regular clients, watching Angelica in the mirror. Angelica smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Chuck is so thoughtful, he plans every detail." She really loved Chuck, his kindness, reliability, ability to see only the good in people. But sometimes that same trait frightened her. Chuck trusted everyone, especially his family, and Angelica knew that this trust could be his undoing. And his father? Casper is such a charming man. Your mother said he insisted on having the wedding at the country club. Angelica tensed, but continued working on her client's hair. Yes, Mr. Carter is very generous. Too generous, she thought, and too attentive. For the past few months, she had felt his gaze on her every time she came to the Carter house. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Then she began to notice how he found reasons to be alone with her, to offer her coffee, show her a new project in the workshop, discuss the details of the wedding. Angelica's phone vibrated. A message from Casper. "We need to discuss the flowers for the wedding. Can you come by the workshop after work?" She quickly deleted the message, hoping Mrs. Harwood hadn't noticed. It was the 3rd message in a week, always under the pretext of wedding preparations. That evening, the Carter family gathered for dinner at their home on Elm Street. The house was modest but cozy, a typical middle-class home with a porch, a small garden, and a 2-car garage. Linda Carter set the table, glancing at her husband from time to time. At 45, she had retained her attractiveness, although in recent years, wrinkles of worry had appeared on her face. "How are things at the workshop?" she asked, handing Casper a plate of fried chicken. "Great. Next week, we're starting a big project, fencing for a new shopping center. Casper spoke confidently, but Linda noticed how he avoided her gaze. After 23 years of marriage, she had learned to read his mood from the smallest details. Chuck perked up. "That's great, Dad. So there won't be any problems with the wedding money?" "No problems at all," Casper replied firmly. "By the way, I've made arrangements with the florist. Angelica will choose the bouquet tomorrow." Linda frowned. "I thought we were going to choose the flowers together. It's a tradition for the groom's mother to help the bride. Angelica said she doesn't have much time because of her work at the salon. I just want to help her." Casper shrugged, but Linda sensed something unnatural in his tone. Chuck looked pleased. "Angelica will be thrilled. She's so worried about everything being perfect." He turned to his mother. "Mom, have you seen the dress she chose?" "She showed me a photo, but said it was a surprise." Linda nodded, but her mind was preoccupied with other things. Casper had changed over the past few months. He had become more attentive to his appearance and had started using a new cologne that she hadn't bought for him. Sometimes his phone would ring late at night, and he would go out to the porch to answer it. He had reasonable explanations for all her questions: clients, suppliers, business problems. After dinner, Chuck went to Angelica's, and Casper locked himself in his office, citing the need to fill out paperwork. Linda cleared the table, trying to push away her disturbing thoughts. Maybe she was just overthinking things. After all, planning a wedding was stressful for the whole family. In his office, Casper sat in front of his computer, but the paperwork remained untouched. Instead, he stared at a photo of Angelica on his phone, a picture he had taken last week when she laughed at his joke in the workshop. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't stop. At first, it was just a liking for his son's girlfriend. Angelica was beautiful, smart, ambitious, exactly the kind of woman he would like to see in their family. But then, his liking grew into something more. He began looking for excuses to meet her, coming up with reasons to be alone with her. And the most dangerous thing was that he thought she felt the same way. His phone vibrated. A message from the bank about a late payment. Casper quickly deleted it. Another problem to solve. But first, the wedding. He would make this day unforgettable for Chuck, whatever it took. Then, he would see. On the other side of town, Angelica sat in her small studio apartment, trying to focus on wedding plans. Chuck had just left, beaming with happiness after telling her about his conversation with his father. He trusted Casper so much, was so proud of him. If only he knew what his father was thinking. Angelica stood up and walked over to the window overlooking the quiet street of Fairview. In a month, she would be Chuck's wife and a member of the Carter family. She should have been happy, but instead, she felt a growing unease. Casper was becoming more and more insistent, and she didn't know how to stop him without ruining her relationship with Chuck. Her phone vibrated again. This time, the message was from Chuck. "I can't wait for our day. Love you." Angelica smiled, but it was a sad smile. She loved him too, enough to marry him, but not enough for it to be enough. Casper was completely different, dangerous, attractive, and too much like the future she feared. 2 weeks later, the tension in the Carter house was almost palpable. Linda sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, looking through the bills she had found in the pocket of Casper's work jacket. Red notices of late payments, threats to cut off the electricity in the workshop, letters from the bank demanding immediate repayment of the loan. The amount of debt made her heart sink. The front door slammed, and Casper entered the house. He looked tired, but when he saw his wife, he tried to smile. "How are you, dear?" He kissed her on the cheek, but Linda smelled women's perfume, not the kind she used. "Casper, we need to talk." Linda spread the bills on the table. "I found this." Casper's face darkened instantly. "Are you going through my things?" "I was washing your work clothes." "These papers fell out of your pocket." Linda tried to remain calm. "Casper, we have to call off the wedding. At least postpone it until better times. No way. Casper gathered the papers and shoved them into his pocket. These are temporary difficulties. I have a plan. What plan? We owe the bank $120,000. They're cutting off the electricity to the workshop in a week. Casper walked to the window, looking toward the workshop. I'm negotiating a big contract, metal structures for a new plant in Pittsburgh. If everything works out, we'll not only cover our debts, but we'll also come out ahead. Linda studied her husband's profile. After so many years of marriage, she knew when he was lying. What if it doesn't work out? It will work out. Casper turned to her, and there was a determination in his eyes that both delighted and frightened her. Trust me, Linda. I've never let this family down. That same day, Chuck was working in the workshop, connecting the electrical wiring to the new ventilation system. Over the past few weeks, he had noticed that his father had become more nervous, often distracted during conversations, and sometimes caught just standing and staring into space. Dad, are you okay? Chuck looked up from his work, noticing that Casper had been staring at the same drawing for 10 minutes. Of course, son. Just thinking about a new project. Casper put the papers aside. By the way, how's Angelica doing? Has she chosen the flowers? Chuck frowned. I thought you already met about that last week. We did, but she couldn't make up her mind. Too many options. Casper began to put away his tools, even though the workday wasn't over yet. Maybe I should talk to her again. Dad, why didn't you ask Mom to help with the selection? She was upset that she wasn't included in the planning. Casper paused. Your mother is busy with work. Angelica is young and has modern tastes. It's better to trust her choice. Chuck nodded, but something in his father's tone seemed strange to him. Too much attention to Angelica. Too many personal meetings about the wedding. However, maybe his father just wanted everything to be perfect. At the Style Beauty Salon, Angelica tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts kept returning to yesterday's meeting with Casper. She had agreed to meet him at a cafe to discuss the music for the wedding, but the conversation quickly turned to personal topics. Angelica, I have something to tell you, Casper began, leaning closer across the table. Mr. Carter, if this is about the wedding... No. He shook his head. This is about us. Angelica felt her pulse quicken. There is no us, Mr. Carter. There's me and Chuck. I know you feel the same way. Casper reached out, almost touching her fingers. I see it in your eyes every time we're alone. Angelica pulled her hand away. You're wrong. I'm marrying your son. But do you love him? The question hung in the air between them. Angelica stood up, throwing the money for the coffee on the table. This conversation never happened, Mr. Carter. And there will be no more conversations like this. Now, the next day, she still felt the burn of his gaze, remembered how her heart had pounded when he leaned toward her. The worst part was that Casper was right. She did feel something. Not love, but attraction. A dangerous, destructive attraction to a man who could destroy her future. Angelica, you have a client, her colleague called, pulling her out of her thoughts. To her horror, the client turned out to be Linda Carter. Mrs. Carter. What a pleasant surprise. Angelica tried to look natural. What shall we do today? Linda settled into the chair, studying her future daughter-in-law's face intently in the mirror. Just a trim, and I wanted to talk about the wedding. Angelica began working on her hair, trying not to meet Linda's gaze in the mirror. Of course, Chuck is so happy. You and Mr. Carter have done a wonderful job raising him. Casper does a lot for him, Linda said slowly. Sometimes too much. He cares about you a lot too. He keeps saying how important it is to make the wedding special for you. Angelica sensed the tension in Linda's voice. He's very kind. Yes, kind. Linda paused. Angelica, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you happy? Really happy with Chuck? The question caught Angelica off guard. Yes, of course. Why do you ask? Linda continued to study her reflection. It's just that sometimes you seem restless, like something is bothering you. Angelica paused for a moment, then continued cutting. Pre-wedding nerves. That's normal, right? Normal, Linda agreed, but there was doubt in her voice. That evening, Chuck had dinner with Angelica at her apartment. She had made his favorite dish, spaghetti with meatballs, but she hardly touched her food. "Are you okay?" Chuck asked, noticing her distraction. "Sure." Just tired. Angelica forced a smile. "Your mom stopped by the salon today." "Really? What did she want?" "A haircut, and to talk about the wedding." Angelica hesitated, wondering whether to mention Linda's strange questions. "Chuck, are your parents happy in their marriage?" Chuck looked at her in surprise. "Of course. Why do you ask?" "Your mom just seemed sad to me, like something was bothering her. My dad's having some business problems," Chuck admitted. "I think mom's worried. But they'll get through it. They always do." Angelica nodded, but her uneasiness remained. The problems in the Carter family ran deeper than Chuck realized, and she, without wanting to, had become part of those problems. Late at night, Casper sat in his workshop, trying to find a solution to his financial crisis. The numbers in his accounting books weren't adding up in his favor. Even if he got the contract in Pittsburgh, the money would only be enough to delay bankruptcy for a few months. His phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "I know about your debts. I can help. Meet me tomorrow at 8 p.m. at the old warehouse on Riverside." Casper stared at the message for a long time. He knew it could be a trap, but he saw no other way out. Chuck's wedding had to happen, no matter what it took. The next day, Chuck noticed that his father looked even more tense than usual. All day long, Casper kept glancing at his watch, getting distracted from his work, dropping his tools twice. "Dad, maybe you should go home early." "You look tired." "No, I have a meeting tonight about that contract." Casper avoided looking at his son. It could be decisive for our future. After work, Chuck went to Angelica's but found that she wasn't home. He called the salon and learned that she had left early, citing a headache. Anxiety began to creep into his heart. Lately, Angelica had become distant, often lost in her thoughts, avoiding conversations about the future. He decided to drive around town, hoping to run into her by chance, and he did, near the Maple Leaf Cafe on Main Street. But she wasn't alone. His father was standing next to her. Chuck parked on the opposite side of the street and watched. The conversation seemed serious, even tense. Casper was explaining something passionately, gesturing with his hands, while Angelica shook her head, clearly refusing something. Then her father put his hand on her shoulder, and Chuck saw her pull away. Something cold and unpleasant stirred in Chuck's chest. This was the third chance meeting between his father and his fiancée in the last 2 weeks, always about the wedding, always without him. When Angelica left and Casper headed for his truck, Chuck started the car and drove home. He found his mother in the kitchen, washing dishes with a kind of angry energy. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Linda turned around, and Chuck saw red eyes. She had been crying. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, dear. Just tired." Linda dried her hands with a towel. "What did you want to ask me?" "Dad's been acting strange lately, and he's been meeting with Angelica a lot about the wedding. Is that normal?" Linda froze. "How often?" "I don't know. I've seen them together a few times. Today, too." Chuck studied his mother's face. "Mom, what's going on?" Linda was silent for a long time. Then she approached her son and took his hands. "Chuck, do you trust me?" "Of course." "Then listen carefully. If you notice anything unusual between your father and Angelica, you must tell me. Immediately, do you think that?" "I don't think anything," Linda quickly interrupted him. "Just be careful." "Promise?" Chuck nodded, but the anxiety in his heart grew stronger. The world that had seemed so reliable and predictable to him was beginning to crack at the seams. and he had no idea what to do with this knowledge. Saturday, September 7th, 8 days before the wedding. Chuck woke up early and decided to surprise Angelica by stopping by the workshop to finish working on a special wedding gift for her, a metal rose he had been secretly crafting for the past few weeks. Arriving at Carter Metal Works at 6:30 in the morning, he saw his father's truck already parked in the lot. Strange, Casper never came to work this early on weekends. Chuck quietly entered through the side door, not wanting to disturb the morning silence. Sounds came from the office, his father's voice on the phone. Chuck headed for his workstation, but the words of the conversation made him stop. "I can't go on like this, Angelica. It's driving me crazy." Casper's voice sounded completely different from usual. There was pleading, desperation in it. Chuck froze, feeling a chill run down his spine. "No, listen to me. What's happening between us isn't just a fling. I'm serious about you." Pause. "How can you talk about Chuck? You know you don't really love him." Chuck leaned against the wall, barely breathing. The world around him began to blur. "Angelica, don't hang up. We need to meet and talk about everything. Tonight. Same place." Another pause. Okay. But this is our last chance to work things out before the wedding." Chuck heard his father hang up and quickly slipped out of the workshop. He got into his car but couldn't start the engine. His hands were shaking, and he had a lump in his throat. His father and Angelica. 20 minutes later, Chuck was still sitting in his car when Casper came out of the workshop. Seeing his son, he approached the car with a surprised expression on his face. "Chuck? What are you doing here?" "I wanted to work on a gift for Angelica," Chuck replied mechanically, avoiding his father's gaze. "Oh, I see." Casper seemed nervous. "I was just checking some documents." "Listen, how about we have a bachelor party tonight? Invite a couple of your friends, go to a bar?" Chuck finally looked at his father. "I can't. Angelica has plans for the evening." "Oh?" Casper tried to look uninterested. "What plans?" "I don't know. She said she was meeting a friend." Chuck studied his father's face, looking for any sign of guilt or shame. But Casper was a good actor. "Well, another time then." When Casper left, Chuck finally started the car and drove home. On the way, he tried to find a rational explanation for what he had heard. Maybe he had misunderstood something? Maybe the conversation was about something else? But deep down, he knew the truth. At home, Chuck found his mother in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. Linda looked up and immediately noticed the expression on his face. "Chuck? What's wrong?" "Mom, tell me honestly. Is there something going on between Dad and Angelica?" Linda slowly put down the newspaper. "Why do you ask?" "Because I just heard him talking to her on the phone. And it definitely wasn't about wedding flowers." Linda covered her face with her hands. "Oh my God!" "You knew?" "I suspected. He's been different these last few weeks. More concerned with his appearance, coming home late, hiding things." Linda lifted her head, and Chuck saw the pain in her eyes. "But I hoped it was just my imagination." Chuck sat down next to his mother. "What should we do?" "I don't know, dear. I don't know." Meanwhile, Angelica stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, trying to decide what to wear to her meeting with Casper. She had already changed her mind about this meeting 3 times, but in the end, she decided she had to clear everything up once and for all. The phone rang. "Chuck." "Hi, dear," she answered, trying to make her voice sound natural. "Angelica, we need to talk." Something in his tone made her wary. "Sure. What about?" "Not over the phone. Can you come over to my place?" "I have plans for the evening." "With my father?" There was a long silence. Angelica felt the ground slip away beneath her feet. "Chuck, I know, Angelica. I know everything." Linda waited for Casper to return home after lunch. She had spent the morning reviewing their financial records, and what she discovered was worse than her worst fears. The workshop's debts were just the tip of the iceberg. Casper had taken out a second mortgage on the house without telling her. He had spent money from their joint retirement account. In just a month, they could lose everything. "Linda, I'm home," Casper called from the hallway. "I'm in the kitchen." Casper entered with a smile, but when he saw the documents spread out on the table, he stopped dead in his tracks. "What's this?" "This is our financial reality, Casper. The one you've been hiding from me." Linda stood up, crossing her arms over her chest. "A second mortgage? Retirement money? When were you going to tell me?" Casper walked over to the table and began gathering the papers. "It's temporary. I'll pay it all back." "How?" "We don't have a penny. In a month, we'll be evicted from our home." "I have a plan." "What plan?" Linda raised her voice. "Meetings with Angelica? Is that your plan?" Casper froze. "What are you talking about?" "Don't pretend, Casper. I know about your meetings. The whole town is talking about how caring you are towards your son's fiancée. It's not what you think. Then what is it? Enlighten me." Linda moved closer. "Tell me, what does Chuck's fiancée have to do with our financial problems?" Casper turned away. "You don't understand. Then explain. Explain how you can betray your own son." "I'm not betraying him." Casper spun around. "I'm trying to save this family." "By having an affair with his fiancée?" "It's not an affair. It's—" Casper stopped, realizing he had said too much. Linda looked at him with growing horror. "My God, it's true. At 7 o'clock in the evening, Angelica sat in the Maple Leaf Cafe, waiting for Casper. She had thought everything through and knew what she had to say. These meetings had to stop. Whatever was or could be between them was wrong. Chuck didn't deserve this betrayal." Casper arrived at exactly 7:30, looking agitated and tired. He sat down across from her without ordering anything. "I thought you weren't coming. I came to end this, Casper." "Don't call me Casper. Not now." He reached across the table, but she pulled her hand away. "Mr. Carter, this has to stop. All these meetings, phone calls, messages. I'm marrying your son in a week, but you don't love him." Casper leaned closer. "You told me so yourself." "I never said that. Not with words. But I saw it in your eyes every time we were together." Casper took her hand, despite her resistance. "Angelica, I can give you what he never could. Passion, adventure, real life. You can give me a broken family and a broken heart." Angelica pulled her hand away. "You have a wife who has loved you for 23 years. You have a son who adores you, Linda knows. She always knew our marriage was just a habit." And Casper paused. "Chuck will find someone else." "My God, are you listening to yourself?" Angelica stood up. "You're willing to ruin your own son's life for what? For an affair with me?" "It's not an affair." Casper also stood up, attracting the attention of the other cafe patrons. "I'm in love with you." The silence in the cafe was deafening. Angelica felt people staring at them, whispering at the neighboring tables. By tomorrow, the whole of Fairview would know what had happened. "This is crazy," she whispered. "You're out of your mind." "Maybe. But you feel the same way and you know it." Angelica looked into his eyes and saw desperation bordering on obsession. For the first time, she felt real fear. "I'm leaving, and I don't want to see you anymore." "Angelica, wait." But she was already walking toward the exit, leaving Casper standing in the middle of the cafe under the curious glances of the other patrons. When Angelica returned home, she found Chuck sitting on the steps in front of her house. One look at his face was enough to know that he knew everything. "How long?" he asked, standing up. "Chuck, it's not what you think." "How long, Angelica?" She lowered her head. "Nothing happened, I swear to you. But something is going on. I heard him talking to you this morning. I saw you meeting Chuck stepped closer. Tell me the truth." Angelica looked up, and he saw tears in her eyes. He said things to me. Compliments. At first, I thought I was imagining it, and then I realized he was serious, and I didn't know how to stop it without hurting you. Chuck stepped back as if she had hit him. Without hurting me? Angelica, do you understand what has happened? My father is in love with my fiancée. I never did anything to encourage it, but you didn't stop it either. The accusation hung in the air between them. Angelica knew he was right. She could have stopped it from the beginning, but she didn't. Part of her enjoyed the attention, the power she had over the two Carter men. Chuck, I love you. No, he said quietly. If you did, this would never have happened. When Chuck returned home at 9:30, the house greeted him with dead silence. In the kitchen, he found a note from his mother. Gone to my sister's. Can't be home right now. Will call tomorrow. Casper was sitting in the living room with a bottle of whiskey, already half empty. Son, he began when Chuck entered. Don't call me that. Chuck stopped in the middle of the room. You have no right. Casper raised his head. His eyes were red, his face gaunt. I can explain everything. Explain what? How you fell in love with my fiancée. How you planned to ruin my wedding. How you betrayed everyone who loves you? It's not that simple. No! Chuck slammed his fist on the table. It is that simple. You're my father. You were supposed to protect me, not steal my woman. Casper stood up, staggering. You don't understand what it's like to feel like your life is over at 48. Angelica made me feel alive again. What about Mom? What about me? Your mother and I have been just roommates for a long time. And you? Casper shook his head. You're young. You'll find someone else. Chuck looked at his father with growing disgust. Do you really think love can just be replaced? That people are things you can throw away and find new ones? Sometimes you have to fight for what you want, even if it destroys other people's lives? Casper didn't answer, and in that silence, Chuck saw the whole truth. His father, the man he had considered a hero his entire life, was capable of any betrayal for his own happiness. The wedding is off, Chuck said quietly. What? You heard me? The wedding is off. Angelica and I have broken up. Something changed in Casper's expression. Does that mean she's available? Chuck looked at his father in horror. Even now, with the family in ruins, Casper could only think of his chances with Angelica. Get out of my house, Chuck whispered. Chuck, this is my house. No! Chuck shouted so loudly that his voice echoed off the walls. This is my mother's house. This is my house. And you are no longer my father. Casper recoiled as if he had been physically struck. You can't mean that. Get out! Now, or I'll call the police. Casper stared at his son for a long time, then put the bottle on the table and headed for the door. At the threshold, he turned around. Someday you'll understand. No, Chuck said. Never. The door closed, and Chuck was left alone in a house that no longer felt like home. His wedding was supposed to take place in a week. Instead, his family lay in ruins, and his heart was broken into pieces. He walked over to the phone to start calling the guests and canceling the celebration. The first number on the list was Uncle Mike, who was supposed to be the best man. Chuck dialed the number, but when his uncle answered, he couldn't say a word. Chuck? Are you there? Uncle Mike. Chuck finally managed to say. The wedding is off. What? Why? Chuck closed his eyes. My father is in love with my fiancée. The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Across town, Casper sat in his truck in the parking lot of the Pine Tree Motel, unable to decide what to do next. He had lost his family, lost Angelica, and was about to lose his business and his home. For the first time in his life, he had no plan. He took out his phone and texted Angelica, I need to see you. Please. The reply came 5 minutes later. "Leave me alone. I'm blocking your number." Casper threw his phone onto the dashboard. The screen cracked, but that was the least of his worries. He started the engine and drove to the workshop. Maybe there, among the metal and tools, he could find a way to fix everything. But when he got to Carter Metalworks, he found a notice from the bank on the door. The workshop had been sealed. Tomorrow the bailiffs would come and inventory all the property. Casper tore the paper off the door and crumpled it up. Everything was falling apart at once, like a house of cards in the wind, and he was the only one to blame. Monday, September 9th. 6 days before what was supposed to be the wedding of Chuck Carter and Angelica Reynolds. Instead of final preparations for the celebration, Fairview, Pennsylvania, was plunged into an atmosphere of scandal and shattered hopes. Chuck spent the weekend on the phone, canceling wedding orders and notifying guests that the celebration would not take place. Each conversation caused him physical pain. He couldn't explain the real reason for the cancellation, limiting himself to vague references to unforeseen circumstances. Mrs. Harwood, the florist, cried into the phone, talking about lost time and money. The restaurant owner was more practical, but coldly informed him of the cancellation fee. Each call reminded Chuck of how his world had fallen apart overnight. Linda never returned home, staying with her sister Mary in the neighboring town of Laurel. The house on Elm Street felt dead without her presence. No smell of coffee in the morning, no sounds of the TV in the living room, no one to ask how his day had gone. Chuck understood that his mother needed time to process what had happened, but her absence made an already difficult situation even more unbearable. At 6:30 in the evening, Chuck was sitting in the kitchen, mechanically stirring the cold soup in his bowl, when he heard the familiar sound of a key in the front door lock. His heart skipped a beat. He had changed the locks on Sunday, but his father might have a spare key to the back door or the garage. Casper entered the house, and Chuck barely recognized his father in this man. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty, and his shirt was stained with what could have been anything: motor oil, food, or alcohol. Stubble covered his cheeks in uneven patches, and his hair stuck out in all directions. But worst of all were his eyes, red from fatigue and alcohol, with the feverish gleam of a man teetering on the brink of collapse. Chuck rose from the table, instinctively preparing for confrontation. Casper stopped in the kitchen doorway, swaying on his feet. The air between them was thick with unspoken accusations and pain. Casper spoke first, his voice hoarse and unsteady. He talked about the need to talk, about how this was still his home, how Chuck was still his son. Chuck responded curtly and sharply, each word like a blow. The men looked at each other across the chasm of broken trust, each seeing the other as the source of his pain. When Casper walked over to the refrigerator and took out a beer as if nothing had changed, Chuck felt a surge of rage. His father drank straight from the bottle, and Chuck noticed his hands shaking. Alcohol was clearly not the first thing he had had that day. The story of the lost business poured out of Casper in a stream of bitterness and self-justification. The bank had taken the workshop, seized all the equipment, and would soon take the house. 20 years of work had turned into nothing. But instead of remorse, Casper's voice was filled with accusations. His wife saw him only as a source of income. His son took everything for granted. No one appreciated his sacrifices. Chuck listened to these accusations with growing disgust. His father blamed everyone but himself. There was not a word about how he himself had destroyed his family, how he had betrayed his son's trust, how he had lost control of his emotions. When Casper got to the topic of Angelica, the atmosphere in the kitchen became electric. He claimed that she had never truly loved Chuck, that she had married him only for stability and security. With him, Casper claimed, she was truly alive. These words cut Chuck like knives because there might have been some truth in them. Chuck knocked the phone out of his father's hand when he suggested calling Angelica to ask about her true feelings. The phone crashed against the wall, and for a moment, silence reigned in the kitchen, broken only by the heavy breathing of both men. A physical confrontation began when Casper grabbed Chuck by the shoulders, trying to make him listen. Chuck pushed his father away with such force that he fell onto a chair. Words flew between them like bullets, accusations, curses, painful truths. Chuck yelled about betrayal, Casper about misunderstanding and the unfairness of life. At this critical moment, the front door opened and Angelica entered the house. She stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw the two Carter men in a state close to fighting. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Angelica explained that she had come at Casper's request, who had been calling her all day, claiming that it was about Chuck. Casper immediately admitted that he had lied. He just needed to see her. The despair in his voice was obvious to everyone present. Chuck tried to stand between his father and his ex-fiancée, but Casper was beyond reason. He talked about love, about a second chance, about how he had lost everything else in his life. Angelica tried to explain that there was nothing between them and never would be, but Casper wouldn't listen. Physical contact occurred suddenly. Casper grabbed Angelica's hand, then pulled her toward him and kissed her, despite her resistance. Chuck saw the fear in her eyes, felt her attempts to break free, and something finally snapped in his mind. The blow was instinctive and powerful. Chuck punched his father in the face with such force that he flew back against the wall. Blood flowed from Casper's broken lip, but instead of sobering him up, it only made him angrier. The fight was short but brutal. The men rolled around on the kitchen floor, striking out wildly. Casper fought with the desperation of a man with nothing to lose, Chuck with the fury of a devoted son. Angelica screamed, begging them to stop, but her voice was lost in the sounds of the struggle. When they got to their feet, both were covered in blood. Casper demanded that Angelica choose between them right then and there. The threat in his voice was clear. If she didn't choose him, the consequences would be unpredictable. Angelica chose Chuck, and that decision was the last straw for Casper. He lunged for the desk drawer where Chuck knew his father kept his old service pistol, a memento of his military service. The metal weapon glinted in the light of the kitchen lamp. The gun in Casper's hands was pointed at his son. His father said that if he couldn't have Angelica, then no one could. The madness in his eyes was absolute. This was no longer the man who had raised Chuck, but someone strange and dangerous. Chuck tried to approach, hoping to disarm his father without using force. He spoke calmly, trying to reach what remained of Casper's sanity. But when his father threatened to shoot if Chuck took another step, it became clear that negotiations were useless. The struggle for the gun was desperate. The first shot rang out, hitting the ceiling and showering them with plaster. Chuck was stronger and younger, and eventually managed to wrestle the gun from his father's hands. For a moment, it seemed that the worst was over. But Casper did not give up. He demanded the gun back, promising to leave forever. When Chuck refused, his father offered him another option, to kill him right there and then. There was no bluff in his words, only the cold confidence of a man ready to die. Casper continued to approach, despite the gun pointed at him. He said that he would pursue Angelica for the rest of his life if he remained alive. His words were not just a threat, they were a promise. The final attack came suddenly. Casper lunged at his son, and Chuck instinctively pulled the trigger. The first shot hit his shoulder, stopping his father's attack. Casper staggered but did not fall, looking at his son with surprise. The last words he uttered were about how proud he was of his son. The next 5 shots rang out almost simultaneously, 2 in the chest, 3 in the stomach. Casper Carter fell to the kitchen floor and did not move. The silence that followed was absolute. Chuck stood with the smoking gun in his hands, unable to believe what had happened. Angelica slowly lowered her hands, which she had used to cover her face during the shooting. Angelica carefully took the gun from Chuck, who handed it over without resistance. His gaze was fixed on his father's body, on the spreading pool of blood, on the open eyes that could no longer see anything. The reality of what had happened slowly sank into his consciousness. When Chuck said aloud that he had killed his father, his voice sounded like a stranger's. Angelica hugged him, and he burst into tears so violently that his body shook. All the accumulated days of tension, pain, and betrayal poured out in those tears. Fairview Patrol Car. 7 received a call at 8:47 p.m. Neighbors reported multiple gunshots on Elm Street. Officers Michael Rodriguez and Jason Miller arrived on the scene 4 minutes later, finding the house outwardly calm, except for a broken window on the first floor. Angelica opened the door for the police, her face red from crying, her clothes rumpled. She led them into the kitchen, where Casper Carter lay on the floor in a pool of blood. Chuck was kneeling next to his father's body, holding his dead hand in his own. The confession came immediately. Chuck told the arriving officers that he had killed his father. Angelica tried to explain the circumstances, talking about self-defense and Casper's threats, but the police followed protocol. Paramedics, who arrived shortly after the police, quickly pronounced him dead. The senior paramedic, Tommy Hughes, examined the body and shook his head. 6 bullet wounds indicated that the shooter had no intention of leaving his victim any chance of survival. Over the next hour, Angelica and Chuck gave preliminary statements to Officer Rodriguez. Both claimed that Casper had threatened them with a weapon and that Chuck had shot in self-defense. However, their versions of events had small but significant discrepancies in the details, which did not escape the attention of the experienced police officer. Detective Sarah Thompson arrived on the scene at 10:30 p.m. The tall woman with short dark hair and piercing gray eyes had a reputation as a detective who didn't miss a thing. In her 10 years with the department, she had investigated numerous homicide cases and had learned to read a crime scene like an open book. The examination of the kitchen gave Thompson her first important clues. Casper was lying on his back, 6 bullet holes grouped together, 1 in his shoulder, 3 in his chest, 2 in his stomach. The scene looked clean enough for a domestic dispute, but the number of shots was alarming. A conversation with Angelica revealed additional details. The girl told about Casper's romantic interest in her and how it caused conflict between father and son. She claimed that she was standing by the wall during the shooting, trying to hide from the bullets. Chuck looked shocked, but his behavior did not quite match the typical reaction of someone who had killed in self-defense. His version of events differed from Angelica's account in several key points, especially regarding who was holding the gun and when. Medical examiner Dr. Evans, who arrived to perform a preliminary examination of the body, gave a conclusion that further complicated the picture. 6 bullet wounds, especially the last 3, were inflicted when the victim was already falling. The shots were fired from a distance of 2 to 3 meters, which was consistent with witness accounts, but the number of wounds exceeded what was necessary for self-defense. At 11:45 p.m., Chuck Carter was arrested on suspicion of murder. He was read his rights and taken to the police station for further questioning. Angelica remained to give additional testimony to Detective Thompson. When Thompson asked about the nature of the relationships within the Carter family, the full picture began to emerge. Financial problems, a love triangle, family conflicts, all of this added up to a motive for murder that went far beyond simple self-defense. Angelica admitted that Chuck had kicked her father out of the house a few days earlier, saying he no longer considered him family. This fact added another important element to the case. Premeditation and planning may have played a role in what happened. Thompson finished gathering preliminary information around midnight. The case promised to be difficult. Too many emotions, too many hidden motives, too many questions without clear answers. She had a thorough investigation ahead of her to determine whether the murder of Casper Carter was an act of self-defense or a premeditated crime. Tuesday, September 10th. The Fairview Police Department rarely dealt with murder cases. The last one was 3 years ago, when a local farmer shot a thief who was trying to steal his tractor. The Carter case promised to be the most high-profile crime in the town's history. Detective Sarah Thompson arrived at the station at 7 in the morning, having spent the night studying the preliminary materials. Chuck Carter was in a holding cell, refusing the services of a lawyer and insisting that he wanted to tell the whole truth. Angelica Reynolds signed a recognizance bond and was released home. Chuck's first interrogation began at 9 a.m. in the interrogation room, a small room with gray walls, a metal table, and 3 chairs. Chuck looked older than his 26 years, his eyes red from lack of sleep, his hands trembling with nervous tension. Thompson turned on the tape recorder and began with the formalities: name, age, address. Then she moved on to the events of the previous evening. Chuck spoke slowly, pausing often to collect his thoughts. His version was mostly consistent with what he had said the day before, but the details were becoming clearer. The story of the family conflict unfolded gradually. Chuck admitted that he had learned of his father's interest in Angelica a few days ago by overhearing a phone conversation. He was aware of the workshop's financial problems, but not to their full extent. His father had concealed the true state of affairs while continuing to plan an expensive wedding. When Thompson asked about the moment of the shooting, Chuck was silent for a long time. Finally, he admitted that he remembered the first shot, to his father's shoulder when he lunged at him. The rest of the shots were a blur, driven by rage and pain from the betrayal. The key moment came when Thompson asked about the number of shots. Chuck initially claimed he didn't remember, but under pressure, he admitted that he continued to shoot even after his father fell. This detail radically changed the classification of the crime. During her lunch break, Thompson met with District Attorney Michael Stone, who had to decide what charges to bring against Chuck. Stone, an experienced lawyer approaching retirement age, carefully studied the case file. There was sufficient evidence for a second-degree murder charge. 6 shots continued firing after the victim fell, the suspect's own confession. Everything indicated that Chuck had acted not only in self-defense, but also under the influence of strong emotional excitement. Angelica's second interrogation took place in a more friendly atmosphere. The girl was nervous, but willing to cooperate. She confirmed most of the details of Chuck's story, but added important information about Casper's behavior in recent weeks. Angelica described how Casper stalked her, arranged chance encounters, and sent her messages. She tried to stop him without damaging her relationship with Chuck, but Casper became increasingly insistent. On the day of the murder, he lured her into the house under false pretenses. Angelica's admission that she did indeed feel some attraction to Casper was critical to the case. Not love, but physical attraction to a charismatic and experienced man. This honesty added complexity to Chuck's motives. He may have felt competition not only because of his father's pursuit of his fiancée, but also because of her ambiguous reaction. Forensic evidence confirmed the basic facts of the case. The gun belonged to Casper and had fingerprints from both sides of the conflict on it. Gunpowder residue on Chuck's hands confirmed that he had fired the shots. Ballistic analysis showed that all 6 bullets had been fired from the same weapon at close range. The forensic medical examination provided a more detailed picture. The first shot to the shoulder was fired when Casper was standing upright and moving toward the shooter. The next 2 shots to the chest were fired when the victim began to fall. The last 3 shots to the stomach were fired when Casper was already lying on the floor or falling. This evidence undermined the claim of complete self-defense. The first 3 shots could be explained as defense against attack, but the last 3 were clearly unnecessary to stop the threat. Interviews with neighbors added context to the family drama. Mrs. Parker, who lived next door, reported loud arguments at the Carter home in recent weeks. Mr. Johnson saw Casper sitting in his car near the house late at night several times, watching the windows. Workshop employees confirmed Casper's financial problems and his changed behavior. Tom Miller, a senior welder, said that his boss had become distracted, often talking on the phone about personal matters and mentioning his son's fiancée several times in an inappropriate context. Bank documents seized by court order revealed the full extent of the financial collapse. The workshop's debts amounted to $180,000. The family home had been mortgaged twice, and retirement savings had been spent. Casper was in a desperate situation, which could explain his desperate behavior. A week after the murder, the prosecution charged Chuck Carter with second-degree murder. The charge was based on the fact that, although he initially acted in self-defense, continuing to shoot after the threat had been neutralized constituted a separate crime. Chuck's court-appointed attorney, David Robert, attempted to have the charge reduced to manslaughter, citing extreme emotional circumstances. However, the prosecution insisted on its position, pointing to the premeditated nature of some of the defendant's actions. The trial took place in January of the following year at the Westmoreland County Courthouse in Greensburg. Linda Carter appeared in public for the first time in months to testify in her son's defense. She talked about how Casper had changed in recent months, the financial problems he had been hiding, and her suspicions about his relationship with Angelica. Her testimony was emotional but convincing. Angelica also testified in Chuck's favor, describing in detail Casper's harassment and the events of the night of the murder. The defense used her testimony to prove that Chuck was acting under the influence of severe emotional distress. The key moment of the trial was Chuck's own testimony. He spoke honestly about his feelings at the time of the murder: the rage, the betrayal, the desire to punish his father for destroying his family. This honesty was both his strength and his weakness. The jury saw his sincerity, but also understood the extent of his anger. The prosecutor emphasized the number of shots fired and the fact that Chuck continued shooting after the victim had fallen. He argued that Chuck had exceeded the limits of necessary self-defense and acted out of revenge rather than fear for his life. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict was a compromise: guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The jury acknowledged that Chuck had acted under intense emotional distress caused by extreme circumstances, but also found that he had exceeded the limits of self-defense. Judge Patricia Henderson sentenced Chuck Carter to 8 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5 years. In handing down the sentence, she noted the tragic nature of the case and the devastating impact of family secrets on all involved. Linda Carter sold the house on Elm Street and moved in with her sister in a neighboring town. The workshop was liquidated, and all the equipment was sold to pay off debts. She found a job at an insurance company in Greensburg and gradually began to rebuild her life. Angelica Reynolds left Fairview a month after the trial. Rumors and judgmental looks made her life in town unbearable. She moved to Philadelphia, where she got a job at a large beauty salon and started a new life under her maiden name. Chuck served his sentence at a correctional facility in Huntington. He participated in rehabilitation programs, earned a degree in electrical engineering through distance learning, and worked in the prison workshop. His mother visited him every month, and gradually their relationship was restored. Fairview slowly forgot about the Carter family tragedy. The house on Elm Street was sold to a young couple with children who knew nothing about its history. The workshop was demolished, and a mini-market was built in its place. Life in the small town went on, but those who knew the Carter family did not forget the lesson about the price of family secrets and unforgiven grievances. Chuck Carter was released on parole after 5 years and 2 months. He moved to another state where no one knew his story, got a job as an electrician at a small company, and slowly began to build a new life. Sometimes at night he dreamed of gunshots and his father's face in his last moments, but with the help of therapy, he learned to live with these memories.